Your right, David, but their left. My left, your right. Thank you so much. Can I now introduce David Edershank, who is he's a Member of Parliament in Victoria. He's in the upper house of the Victorian Parliament, and he represents the Western Metropolitan region of Victoria. He is one of the 5 MPs representing the Legalised Cannabis Party around Australia. And as we have seen, there is more and more people sitting on the crossbench like David who want to see reform, not just in the medicinal cannabis field, but also in the adult use cannabis. So please welcome David Edershank. Imagine there's a fire there, David. This is a fireside chat. We didn't quite get the technology to put a fire in here for our fireside chat. But David, you were elected, it's getting on for nearly 17 months? November 2022. You've been pretty busy in that time.
We have, yes. Learning the trade. Fortunately, we had some good guidance along the way, to wit, the path sown by Fiona.
It's but look, as you've seen, as an upper house member who sometimes has the balance of power, it does put you into a negotiating position. But maybe if you could tell the audience just some of the, what you do is on the tin, as they say. You're the Legalised Cannabis Party, so we're fairly clear about what your main goals are. But you've also been doing a lot of work that certainly helps people in this room. And if you can just touch on some of those.
Sure. I mean, if we recognise that cannabis was prohibited in Victoria 96 years ago, we're really talking about not just a regulatory problem, we're talking about a cultural problem. And so we've adopted an approach which is to take multiple lines of attack with the government to try and get change. So in the last 12 months, which feels like it could have been a lifetime, we've first of all hit the question of medicinal cannabis driving and the fact that there should just be a basic right for medicinal cannabis patients to be treated in exactly the same way as any other prescription medication person, And it just seems to us ridiculous. You can take massive amounts of codeine or benzodiazepines or whatever, and if you get picked up in a random drug test, it's not even going to detect. But if you are picked up, you're going to be treated the same as someone who's on methamphetamine. So that's one. Also, in terms of directly relating to this audience, we are in the middle of, or we're just commencing an inquiry into workplace drug testing, where again what we're seeing is employers consistently treating people on medicinal cannabis not like patients, not like people on a legal drug. They're treating them with a zero tolerance policy and with no linkage between the presence of cannabis in their system and impairment. So there's basic rights there, and so we're exploring that one, and we might want to come back to that.
Yes, we will.
We've also attacked on a different field, which is that of hemp and hemp production, because we sort of describe that as the sort of drive-by shooting victims of the prohibition on cannabis and THC. And then lastly, in November, we introduced a private members bill, which is the personal use of cannabis. Which we're calling ACT+.
Yes, and I think is everyone aware of the ACT's regulation? Hands up if you're not aware that the ACT decriminalised or regulated cannabis personal use. So the personal use of cannabis in the ACT, the Capital Territory, was decriminalised or they called it legalised, I'd say decriminalised, and it allows for adults in the ACT to grow 2 plants outside without lights, and they're allowed to possess, I think, 25 grams, which for any of the growers in the room would understand the problem with balancing that 25 grams and 2 plants, even if you are growing them outside in a Canberra climate. Your bill, 6 plants?
6 plants in total rather than 2 per adult, which is the ACT.
Yep.
The ability to share, so from your crop. So you can have it on you. You can take up to 50 grams with you if you're travelling. We're not saying you can smoke in public, but you can take 50 grams with you. You can gift. So gifting in the ACT legislation is still an offence. And there's various other anomalies that we're trying to address. So, for example, under the ACT legislation, you can grow, as we said, 2 plants per adult, but it's still an offence to have or to gift a seed, which does raise an interesting metaphysical sort of question as to how that works. We're also saying, whether you're in Canberra or in the ACT, you don't have to be Costa to understand that, like, you need to be able to grow through the year, and unless you've got the ability to use a greenhouse or an indoor space, you've got one crop.
Yeah.
So it's not going to provide that sort of sustainability that we're looking at.
And I believe, like we've seen with President Biden, and we've seen in a lot of the jurisdictions around the United States, and also in some of the jurisdictions in countries in Europe, there's an expectation that with personal use legalisation, there would be an expungement or a pardon for people who had been done for personal possession.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the misconceptions is that, first of all, we know that there's about 9,000, on average, 9,000 people a year in Victoria who are charged on a cannabis-related offence. 92% of those people are purely personal use. So you can imagine, as that accumulates over time, you have all of these people who, for example, simply can't get a working with children or working in the health industry check. In the health industry, it's not whether you've been convicted, it's whether you've been charged. So what we're seeking is to have, as part of the first stage of change, that there would be an automatic expungement of any previous record or conviction or requirement to disclose if all you're dealing with is personal possession or use.
In thinking about people growing their own, and when we're talking about from a medical product that's not GMP, and that's not some of the regulations that we've been speaking about earlier today. However, I think the statistics, and you might know them offhand, is that the number of people who report using illicit cannabis for health purposes is fairly high. Have you ever thought about whether this personal use bill would affect the medicinal cannabis market in Victoria?
Oh, you can see this is a spontaneous process.
We did actually not prepare this.
Yeah, look, I think there are obviously, notwithstanding, there was some really interesting data this morning about the falling prices. I think there is a fundamental issue about equity and access, and so, if you're like me on a good salary, or many people in this room, purchasing cannabis is not an issue so long as you've got a practitioner, et cetera, et cetera. For a lot of people, though, it's clearly not possible. They do need an affordable way to access cannabis, and really there's 2 faults to that. One would be personal use, the ability to grow yourself, and then the second element, which we'll hopefully be tackling later this year, is compassionate use, which would include potentially subsidisation by the state for people with particular conditions, such that they can access medicinal cannabis that they otherwise would not be able to afford.
Which is terrific, and certainly the industry is looking into their own compassion schemes, and I know some companies have their own compassion schemes here. You had the Parliamentary Budget Office look at the value of the cannabis industry, the illicit cannabis industry in Victoria. How much is it worth?
Well, based on the 2019 AHW survey, we're going to get it updated, although it hasn't changed much.
It's been fairly steady.
The illicit market here in Victoria is worth conservatively about $1.2 billion a year. based on about 85 tonnes. People sort of say, well, that's hard to imagine in terms of bulk. The analogy I like, and which seems to be helping some of our members from the National Party who have a more rural mindset, is if you were to pack it into wool bales, which each hold about 120 kilos or about 1.25 metres. If you stack them up, it would be 3 times the height of the Eureka Tower here in South Bank. So it's well, if I may use technical parliamentary term, it's a shitload of weed.
Yeah.
And you know, we sort of say it's a grey economy. So there's all sorts of benefits, not just in court time, but also in terms of taxation, in terms of regulation, in terms of quality and safety, to try and bring as much of that within the realm of regulation.
Yeah.
Because prohibition is simply to exclude yourself from that process. And clearly, after 95 or 96 years, prohibition's probably not working, and it's probably, if we give it another year or two, it's probably not going to change that outcome.
Yeah, I think that 85 tonnes kind of speaks to itself as to the success of prohibition in this state. And I wonder how that $1.24 billion compares to the medicinal cannabis market in Victoria. I suspect they would be quite jealous of that figure in there. The two areas that you touched on before that Parliament's doing, which is really specifically around medicinal cannabis, and this is around driving, and we know that when we speak to patients, when there's surveys of patients, when we have these forums throughout the year, the patients and the driving regulations and the driving rules that discriminate against medicinal cannabis patients are top of mind for many patients and certainly for many practitioners and obviously for the industry. I think many people have been quite rightly somewhat critical of the industry in their involvement in the campaigns to drive change. And I use drive change very purposely because that is the name of one of the campaigns to change the driving laws, and yet we've been unsuccessful. I mean, I put up a couple of bills in my time in the Victorian Parliament. We've got bills in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, and here in Victoria. Now, if you could give us a little bit of an update as to where we're up to with the ongoing saga of the government allowing, medicinal cannabis patients to drive when it's safe to do so, where we're up to and what the industry should be doing and could be doing.
Yes, we're having a world first on closed track driving trial, which is hard to say and keep a straight face.
No.
It is a world first. There's no two ways about it, and it is a world first because nobody's ever done it on a racetrack before.
Yeah, because again, it's a stupid idea.
We were tempted to ask in Parliament, does this have something to do with the Formula One and, stoned racing or something?
Yeah, I don't think any world records are going to be broken in the stoned racing Formula One, but...
But we will see in mid-year lots of photo ops of people getting into cars with monitoring gear, having been appropriately dosed up, and then driving around a particular racetrack, which can remain nameless at this point in time, and being evaluated as they go. We've sort of made the point to the government that, like, for example, a few years ago in the Netherlands, they actually did exactly that, only they actually did it on real roads with real people, and, nobody died, and there's actually a whole data set there. But anyway, that's just... And
in fact, Swinburne University, an Australian university, was involved in that trial in the Netherlands.
As was the Lambert Initiative. So
Lambert, yes.
Yeah, some of our finest minds. So
we had
it's just been kicking the can down the road.
We had a premier who said this needs to change, and then that premier changed. So now we've got a new premier. What should everyone in this room that is involved in this industry, that wants to see our patients and the people who benefit from the medicine that people are growing and making in this room, what should they be doing? Should they be writing to the members of parliament? Should they be protesting on the steps?
I always love a good protest
I know
on the
you
steps.
do.
I guess, look, both Rachel Payne, my colleague from South Eastern Metro, who was the other legalised cannabis person who got elected, we've really been surprised at how little input there's been in the processes from the industry. For goodness sake, even if it's only purely for self-interest purposes, there is a strong argument for engaging. So when we had the sort of campaign around Medcan driving about this time last year, there was one or two firms that put a bit of time and energy into it, otherwise everyone watched the show. When we had the hemp inquiry, I think there was 2 producers who put in a submission. For the workplace drug testing, and obviously workplace drug testing and Medcan driving have a lot in common. I think there's 2 producers who've bothered to put in a submission. So, and I guess like that bus has sort of left the station now, but we do have a survey that's still open where we're looking for patients who want to tell stories about their workplace drug testing experiences. It's on the parliamentary website, it's on our websites. For goodness sake, get involved. But I think as an industry, there really needs to be a more proactive approach to patient advocacy, as well as good old-fashioned self-interest in preserving the sector. With our previous speaker, I don't know if he's still here, but he put up the perfect storm. But as they're talking, and in terms of what we've heard today, it sort of reminded me of that final scene in the movie The Terminator, where she says, a storm is coming, I think we don't have to be that perceptive to recognise that there is a regulatory storm coming. And there's also a really live debate which we're trying to push forward.
Yeah.
And the industry needs to engage politically, more assertively, and more collaboratively. I guess that would be the key.
We're going to talk to John Ryan in a minute about the changing in community attitudes to cannabis. And I think, in fact, the medicinal cannabis industry has played a very important role in changing people's attitudes around cannabis in general. But as a final question from me, and if people do have a question to ask David, we're happy to take some from the floor. Obviously, the name, it's legalised, you're the Legalised Cannabis Party. So for you personally, David, and I'm not asking you to sort of give me a party policy, but do you have an idea in your head about what the cannabis market or the cannabis landscape in Australia might look like in 5 years if we were to get legalisation? And what that legalisation might be.
I guess in terms of having spent about a year now sort of arguing with colleagues and ministers and such like, and following in the great work that you've done previously, we've done, all the research has been done. So like Fiona in 2021 led the inquiry into cannabis. We've got the Pennington Institute's report from 2022. So we are fortunate, unlike our colleagues in New South Wales and WA, the work's been done. It's time to make some decisions. The way it's shaping at the moment is into basically 2 parts, I'd say. One part is if we call it ACT plus, and we've talked about that. And we don't really care. We think it's a bit of a semantic swamp as to whether or not we call it legalisation or decrim.
Yeah.
The basic premise is, ACT is publicised as decrim, but there is no penalty, which means to me it's legalised within limits. So that's the easy one, and we're saying to the government, do that now. It really doesn't require, it's not rocket science. In terms of commercialisation, which is I think of the second cohort, that is a far, far more complex question. And so what we're saying there is that having successfully done personal use, the government should then look at an expert advisory panel to look at how would you implement a commercial market.
Yep.
And even within a gathering, or maybe it's especially within a gathering of Legalised Cannabis Victoria members, we don't have agreement on what that would look like. There is not a simple no-brainer model. So there needs to be a deliberative process, and I think that will shape it. I think we can expect that it will have a generous revenue-raising component, and it will have a role for the state. But as to the extent and the quantum, that's yet to be determined.
And I think the revenue raising thing is an interesting thing to point out for Australia as quite a unique country compared to the North Americas and even jurisdictions in Europe, is that our states cannot raise their own taxes. So Victoria can't tax cannabis. So we can't go in there and say, hey, $1.24 billion industry, take 20% of that, it's all yours. We can't bribe the politicians with that.
We do, however, well, we can actually, because there is already plenty of precedent where there are revenue sharing arrangements and where there are excise arrangements. So yes, you're right, the state can't do it, but the state can agree.
With federal assistance we can.
Correct,
yes,
absolutely.
With federal assistance we can. Are there any burning questions for David out there? Excellent. David, we are almost on time. Almost on time. Please thank David Edershank, not just for today, but for the work that he and Rachel Payne are doing here. See ya.
Yep.
Whoa, sorry.